The number one absolute best way to lose belly fat. Millions of people are trying to lose belly fat, not just to look better or to fit into their clothes better, but because belly fat is associated with all kinds of disease, from blood pressure to diabetes to cardiovascular disease and stroke. But even though all those people are trying, more people than ever are having obesity and diabetes and belly fat. So in this video, we're going to teach you the only way that you can lose belly fat and keep it off for good. And it may not be as hard as you think. In fact, it may even be the opposite of what you think. Coming right up. Hey, I'm Dr. Ekberg. I'm a holistic doctor and a former Olympic decathlete. And if you want to truly master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss anything. In order to get the bigger picture, to really get the full benefit, we need to understand a few mechanisms around belly fat, like where does it actually come from? What's the mechanism to actually get rid of it? So along the way, we're going to talk about a few mechanisms and we're going to dispel a few myths. And if you hang in to the end, then you're going to have a totally different picture on this than you ever thought. The first thing that we need to clear up is the issue of cause and effect, because belly fat is an effect and we need to understand the cause if we're ever going to hope to get rid of it for good. And the problem is that we all focus on the fat, on the belly, but the fat is not the problem. And when people talk about how belly fat is dangerous, what they're talking about is an association. It is very true that it is unhealthy to have a lot of belly fat, but it doesn't mean that it's the belly fat that's unhealthy. The belly fat is a reflection of something unhealthy. It's the result of something unhealthy. And we need to ask, how did the fat get there? Because the thing that got the fat there is the dangerous thing, not the fat itself. The fat is just fat. It's just sitting there. How does it get there? And like we've talked about before, there is a disease called Cushing's. And in Cushing's, we have an extremely high level of cortisol. Cortisol triggers blood sugar, and blood sugar triggers insulin, and insulin creates insulin resistance, and insulin is a fat-storing hormone. Insulin helps promote the conversion of other fuels into fat, and the combination of cortisol and insulin stores it around the midsection. So the mechanism of storing belly fat is through the hormones cortisol and insulin. So now we need to understand a lot of different things about fat and which ones are safe and which ones are dangerous, because our world is riddled with myth and fat phobia. So the next thing that we need to talk about is just that, fat phobia. We live in a world that for 50 years we've been told that fat is the root of all evil. Fat has too many calories. You eat fat, you get fat. I grew up with that mindset, and I bought into it, and I ate low fat, and I was miserable because I didn't understand these things back then. As we're going to talk about today, fat is not only okay, but it is our preferred fuel, and it is a good food source. The reason fat got such a bad reputation was that they observed a bunch of people with heart disease, and then they watched how much fat these people ate, and they said, oh, fat is bad. They didn't reflect over the fact that these people also ate a bunch of sugar that triggered insulin, and that most of the fat that they ate back between the 1950s to the 1980s was margarine, which is the worst kind of fat. It is a pure toxin, and if you eat a lot of margarine, you will get sick. So these people got sick, and they blamed it all on fat, and especially saturated fat. But they've done lots of studies since that have shown that saturated fat is not a problem. And I'm going to point out some things that will help you understand that picture much, much better. Fat phobia is based mostly on misconceptions that we observe fat on the body and then we think that eating fat makes you fat. We've all heard you are what you eat, so we think that's how it works with fat also. But we have to understand, and we'll talk about this a lot, that it's not what you eat that ends up on the body. It is what you eat that results in certain hormones, and after certain digestive processes and metabolic reactions end up on the body, and that is completely different. What we have done is we observe fat and we see fat and we think fat's the bad guy. We observe cholesterol in fatty plaques and we think that cholesterol is the bad guy. That's not a causative relationship, it's an association. And just to bring home how ridiculous that is, let's say that you come across a house burning. There's a house fire somewhere, and lo and behold, there's the fire department. And so you see the two together. Does that mean that the fire department is the bad guy, that they're causing the fire? Just because everywhere there's a fire, you see the fire department? Of course not. All right? It's an association. Which came first? We don't know from observing the association. There is no causative relationship. All right? We're just looking at the two together, and it doesn't tell us anything. So we need to start understanding the mechanism of how did the fire department end up there? The fire was there first. All right? How did the cholesterol get there? The damage was there first. Even though it's getting better, we still have an extreme fat phobia. And I cringe every time I go through a grocery store and I see all these labels with low fat, heart healthy, low fat sausage, low fat yogurt, low fat this or that. And it means that we're still sold on that idea, that people still buy into that mentality that low fat is better. And of course, it's in every dietary guideline out there, from the USDA to the World Health Organization. They tell to eat less than 30% fat overall and less than 10% of total fat from saturated fat. But it's outdated information. So next, to understand where fat comes from and why it ends up on the body, we need to understand energy metabolism. Why does the body store fat there? Well, here's the reason. That your body has a continuous need for energy. The need for energy is very stable, right? You can't just shut down. You're not like a machine or a computer where you can just turn it off. You need a stable supply of energy. But the supply of energy, the intake of food, is not so stable. And today, of course, there is more food available on the planet for most people, so we don't have that urgent problem. But our bodies are built during circumstances where we could go a day or two or three without food. So we had a stable need for energy, but we didn't have a steady supply. Does that mean that the body shuts down, that you get hungry and you say, oh, I guess I'm out of fuel, I'll just lay down and die? No, your body creates more energy so that you can go out and have the resources to have the focus and the energy to find more food. And that's where fat comes in. So during a famine, you burn the fat so that you can have energy and go find food. During the feast, you take the excess and you store it. Right? It's so basic and it sounds so simple, but it's so profound that we have a stable need, but we have an unstable supply. That's why the body has to store fat, and it can store a tiny little bit of energy as carbohydrate, as glycogen, and it can store an almost infinite amount of fat. If it could only store carbohydrate, then it would be true that when you ran out of fuel, you would just lay down and die. The species would be gone long, long ago, because you have about 1 day's worth of glycogen, but everyone has weeks and months worth of fat. So that's just how it works. Next, we need to understand what type of fat the body stores. and it stores primarily saturated fat. So it stores a little bit of everything. You're going to find a mix of just about every fat, but the vast majority, the greatest percentage of fat that is stored in the body is going to be two fatty acids. One is a saturated chain of 16 carbons called palmitic acid, and the other is a chain of 18 carbons called stearic acid. So when we're talking about belly fat, we're talking about those two fatty acids primarily. We're talking about palmitic and stearic acid. They are the majority of the fat that is stored on your midsection that you're trying to lose. So now we come back to you are what you eat. And people think that, oh, I have stearic, I have saturated fat on my belly. That must mean saturated fat is bad. No, it's an efficient storage form. It's a great form for the body to store energy. So think about this for just a moment. A cow eats grass. And then we eat the cow, and the cow is full of saturated fat. Where did that come from? Grass doesn't have saturated fat. Grass has virtually no fat at all, but the grass has carbohydrates. It doesn't have carbohydrates we can break down, but the cow can break them down, and then it takes those glucose molecules from the carbohydrate and it turns them into fat. And it turns them primarily into the same fats that we do, palmitic acid and stearic acid. And if you think about it some further, then that steak also has cholesterol, but grass doesn't have cholesterol. So the cow makes it. Okay? So the food and what it turns into are two completely different things. You can have a vegan who eats plants, and their belly fat is also going to be palmitic acid and stearic acid. And a vegan can have high cholesterol without ever eating any cholesterol. So it's not about what we eat, it's the type of hormones that the food triggers that results in the different types of fat and cholesterol that are being manufactured. So the key to understand is that it doesn't matter if you eat an excess of starch, or you eat an excess of protein, or you eat an excess of fat, it will all get stored as these two fatty acids, stearic acid and palmitic acid, because it's a convenient storage form. What does matter is that carbs and protein and fat trigger different insulin responses, and the more insulin, the more probable that you're going to store that extra energy as fat. If you eat carbs, then you're going to have a high tendency to store. If you eat fat, then there's a greater tendency that it's just going to float around and you'll burn it rather than that you're going to store it. But yes, excesses will get stored. So next we need to dispel a huge myth. And this is about what fuel does the body actually burn? Because with a lot of popularity from the keto and the low carb movement where people are burning fat, losing weight, there's been this notion established, this idea presented that fat is the preferred fuel. And then everyone who's opposed to keto or carnivore or any low carb, they say that, oh, no, that's not true, that fat is bad, saturated fat, that your body burns primarily carbohydrates. All right? And we're going to dispel this myth once and for all. I'm going to give you the numbers straight out. So some people say, well, what about low fat? That there were some followers that have been doing low fat forever and they eat less than 10% fat, and they say that this is the way to go, and they eat 70% carbohydrate. It doesn't matter if you eat mostly carbs or protein or fat. The body will still burn mostly fat. And here are the numbers. Basal metabolic rate. That is how much energy your body burns at rest. So we're going to base this on 2,000 calories just to have some numbers to work with. And for the average person, their basal metabolic rate is about 70%. Their movement is about 20% of total calories. And then there's something called thermogenesis. Those are various processes in the body that generate heat that account for about 10%. So basal metabolic rate is about 1,400 calories. Movement is about 400 calories. And thermogenesis, the generation of heat, is about 200 calories per day for the average person. And this does not include exercise. So if your basal metabolic rate is 1,400, if you on average you're using 2,000 calories, and then you exercise another 500, then that 500 is on top of what we're talking about here at first, but we'll include that toward the end. Now, what are the organs? Where are most of these calories spent? Well, the biggest spender in the body is the liver. Your liver is a little 3-pound blob of tissue that is your metabolic factory. It converts chemicals into other chemicals and nutrients. It uses 27%. More than a quarter of all the energy is used by that little blob called your liver. That's 378 calories. Your brain uses about 19, often we hear the number 20, but I saw 19 in this particular example, so we'll go with that for now. That's 266 calories. Muscles use 18%, or 252 calories. And this is muscles at rest. This is before muscles do anything. That is just muscles sitting around existing. Their basic circulation, their basic muscle tone is 252 calories. Your kidneys use 10% of your energy. That is the most metabolically active organ in your body. That's the hardest working organ in your body. Your kidneys are just a few ounces worth of tissue, and they use 10% of your calories, 140 calories. Your heart is also a hard worker, but not quite as hard as the kidneys. It uses 7% of your calories, or 98 calories. And all the other tissues together use the other 19%, or 266 calories. So the interesting part here is that the liver uses 85% of its calories from fat. Okay? It prefers fat. The brain uses anywhere from 0 to 75%. So the brain is the only exception in this picture, because all the other organs, they run primarily on fat. But the brain can't use fat. The brain can use two other fuels. It can use glucose or ketones. So if you're in a fully fed carbohydrate state, then glucose is high and the brain uses virtually 100% glucose. I'm sure there's like a couple of percent ketones in there, but let's say 100% glucose. However, if you're fasting, if you're in deep ketosis, then the brain uses ketones primarily, and it's a better and it's a more stable fuel. The brain actually functions better with ketones. And this could make sense if we think about the fact that hunters, when they were without food for a day or two, they were in ketosis, but they still had to focus, they still had to function at their best to be able to find food and to be effective in the pursuit of the hunt so that they can survive. So the brain is the exception, but all the other organs use 85 to 90% of their calories from fat. So at rest, 85 to 90% of the energy in the body comes from fat. So when we convert all of those into calories, and the heart, by the way, is the most fat-hungry organ of all, where they're estimating 90% of the calories come from fat. So when we convert the liver energy from fat, it's 85% is 321 calories. From the brain, it's 0 to 200 calories, depending on if we're fully carb-fed or if we are fasted. Muscles use 214 calories, kidneys use 119 calories of fat, the heart uses 88 calories, and everything else uses 226 calories. So then we need to add in the movement. And again, this is movement without exercise. This is just the regular movement, picking up things, walking around, doing your thing. It's not going for a mile jog or a 1 hour walk or anything like that. It's just moving around where you are normally. And that accounts for 20% of your calories. So this is not part of the basal metabolic rate. This is movement on top. So 20% of your calories are 400 calories. And again, 85% of movement comes from fat. The muscles prefer to burn fat at rest, and they prefer to burn fat as high as they can. For any level exercise where they can keep up with oxygen, they're going to burn about 85% fat. The only change is when you get into anaerobic, when your heart rate gets over 120, when you start huffing and puffing, now the glucose component increases. So around heart rate of 120, you're at about 50-50, and then above that, when you start huffing and puffing, the glucose becomes dominant. But anything below that, like a leisurely walk or basic activity or even up to a medium walk, you're going to burn primarily fat. So 85% of that is 340 calories. And then the thermogenesis, that's all the other organs, everything else the body does. And I didn't find a number on that, but there's no reason to believe that that would be different than the 85%. So we'll go with 170 calories on that for right now. And the reason I say that 85% is that that's just where most of the organs are functioning the best. Because when the body uses fat, when the body converts fat into energy, it happens in the mitochondria with something called oxidative phosphorylation. And everything seems to sort of balance out around that 85% mark. And the only exception is when we're in a fight-flight response and there's a crisis or something called exercise where we raise the heart rate and we depend more on glucose during that time that we're in that high state of exercise. So let's add up all those numbers, and if we go with a conservative and we assume that we're in a feasted carbohydrate state, then this would be 0, and we end up with 1,478 calories, which accounts for 74%. So about 3/4 of your energy, of all of your energy before exercise, comes from fat. And if we are in ketosis, if we're fasting or doing keto, then we could have as much as 200 calories from fat for the brain, and that would put us at 84%. So very, very close to the 85% that fat burning, that organs use for fat burning. So what that means, of course, then, if 74% comes from fat, then the rest primarily comes from carbohydrate. Now, there's a few percent of protein in there, depending on how much you eat, but for the purposes of this illustration, we're just going to exclude protein, but that would throw the numbers by a few percent. So the number of carbs that you use would be 26% plus whatever amount of exercise that you do above the aerobic threshold. But let's say that you're exercising up to the aerobic threshold, then it doesn't mean that anything above that is all glucose. You're still using as much fat as you can keep up with. So all of the aerobic capacity is still there as the foundation, and then the anaerobic is on top of that. So I don't have an exact number, but I think you would have to exercise quite a bit to take that 26% up to 30. And I think that you would pretty much have to be a world-class athlete to do extreme anaerobic workouts to get it up to 40. So what this shows us is that fat is the preferred fuel. So then you're saying, well, what about the people who eat low fat? How can they burn 75% fat if they only eat 10%? Well, this brings it back to everything that we talked about here, that it doesn't matter if you eat all carbs because your body can't store carbs. Your organs prefer fat. So even if you're not going to store the energy, your body still converts it from carbohydrate to fat before you use it. So you might as well eat the fat and save the body the trouble of converting it. And then you're saying, oh, but fat is bad. It's like, I've heard, I hear what you're saying, and I believe it, and it works, and I eat low carb, but I just can't make myself eat fat. And here we're back to the fat phobia. We've heard it so many times that fat is bad, saturated fat is bad, it causes this and that. And it's just not true. Most of the studies, like I said, they're based on margarine and they're based on grain-fed meat. These studies are not based on people who eat high-quality meat, who eat high-quality vegetables, who eat nuts and seeds and whole food, and who cook from scratch. It's based on processed foods and chemicals and fake food. The vast majority of cells in your body prefer fat. They burn about 85% fat, even though they can burn both protein and glucose and fat. The brain is an exception. It doesn't use protein, it doesn't use fat, it uses glucose and ketones. And the only other exceptions, the major exceptions, are red blood cells, because they have no mitochondria, they have no nucleus. It's a different type of cell, but the total mass of red blood cells is very small, and the metabolic activity of a red blood cell is very low because it doesn't do anything except sort of float around and carry oxygen. So the red blood cells, the lens and the retina in your eye, they have no mitochondria. They cannot use fat. They use glucose only. But the total energy consumption of these tissues is probably less than 1%. Okay? It's not going to change these numbers significantly at all. So I wanted to share a little study that I found to illustrate and sort of reinforce some of these points. And we don't want to base all of our opinions on one study, but they can still kind of help point us in a direction, especially when the results are incredibly clear. They had known that stearic acid, the saturated long-chain fatty acid that we talked about, the 18 carbon, they had found that it could reduce the spread of metastatic tumors. And they also knew that visceral fat, belly fat, could increase and promote the spread of metastatic tumors. So then they figured if we can find a way to reduce the visceral fat, then maybe we'll have a tool to reduce metastatic tumor spread. So the cancer part is just sort of an aside here, but it's an interesting note. We're going to focus on the visceral fat, the belly fat that we're talking about. So they fed 4 groups of mice. They fed them either stearic acid, the saturated fat, they fed them linoleic acid from safflower oil, or oleic acid from corn oil. And one group was fed a low-fat diet. So what happened? Total body fat didn't change a whole lot, even though the visceral fat went down by 70%. However, the lean body mass increased in the mice fed saturated fat. And the final thing they found was that the blood sugar was dramatically lower in the mice fed saturated fat. So all of the things that we're looking for in diabetes and metabolic syndrome, all the things associated to belly fat, to visceral fat, to the so-called dangerous fat, it is all about insulin. It's about the hormones that create the storage. And when you feed the body a good, stable, solid food, a stable fuel source, then we reduce the insulin and we improve all these markers. So the number one absolute best way and the only way to lose belly fat forever is to do it by reducing insulin resistance, because insulin is the hormone that puts the fat there. And you do this by reducing the sugar, by reducing the carbs, and by increasing the fat, but not the plant fats, not the safflower oil and the corn oil and the soybean oil. You do it by increasing the saturated fat, which is a stable, neutral, good fat. It doesn't get oxidized. It is inflammation neutral, whereas all the plant oils are high in omega-6s, which means that they promote inflammation through an inflammatory pathway. You reduce the carbs, you reduce the frequency of meals, because every time you eat anything, you stimulate a little bit of insulin. The longer you go without food, the lower the insulin is allowed to drop. Don't be afraid of saturated fats. Eat a good amount of saturated fats and monounsaturated fats from a good source like extra virgin olive oil. And the only word of caution is that when you hear that something is described as good, don't think of it as a superfood. Don't think that the more you eat of it, the better everything is going to be. And it doesn't matter if it's saturated fat or blueberries or chocolate or turmeric or garlic. Okay? Eat a moderate amount. Eat what fits into your diet. Eat until you get full. Practice some intermittent fasting. Cut your carbs. Fill up with fat until you're full. But don't think that when you're full, it's going to get better if you eat a little bit more. Okay, we're not talking about that. Get that idea of superfood out of your head. It's just fuel. It's good fuel if it's natural. It's bad fuel if we messed with it. If we destroyed it or altered it or pulverized it, then it's not good anymore. But if it is resembling the way we got it out of the ground or off the tree or we hunted it down, then it is a good food. If you're going to lose belly fat for good, it's not about the number of belly crunches, it's not about the number of calories, it's about reducing insulin resistance. If you enjoyed this video, make sure that you check out that one. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.